They laughed when the deaf bride arrived until the rancher said, "She is better than all of you." The dust swirled gently on the dirt road leading to Willow Creek Ranch, catching the late afternoon sun like flecks of gold. Clara stepped down from the weathered stagecoach, her simple white dress clinging to her frame, the hem frayed from the long journey. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the wildflowers tucked into her dark hair, her only adornment. The townsfolk gathered near the barn, their whispers sharp as thorns, their laughter slicing through the warm Montana air. "A deaf bride?" one woman muttered, her voice loud enough to carry. "What's a mute girl gonna do on a ranch?" Clara's eyes, wide and hazel, flickered toward the crowd, catching their sneers, but she held her chin high. She couldn't hear their words, but she felt their weight. She'd felt it her whole life, ever since scarlet fever stole her hearing at 7, leaving her in a silent world where judgment spoke louder than sound. Clara had come to Willow Creek answering an ad from a rancher named Amos Tate, a widower seeking a wife to share his life on the sprawling cattle ranch. Their letters, exchanged over months, were filled with practical promises. He'd provide a home, she'd help with chores. But Clara poured her heart into those pages, describing her love for tending gardens, her knack for mending clothes, her quiet determination to build a life. Amos's replies were kind, steady, like the man himself. Yet now, standing before the crowd, Clara wondered if she'd misread his words. The townsfolk's laughter grew bolder, a man in a Stetson chuckling, "Amos must be desperate to pick a girl who can't even hear a cowbell." Clara's fingers tightened around her small satchel, her only possessions inside, a Bible, a quilt her mother made, and Amos's letters. She didn't need to hear to know she was unwanted. Inside the barn, Amos stood waiting, his broad shoulders filling out a clean flannel shirt, his weathered face softened by nervous anticipation. At 40, he was a man of few words, known for his fairness and his stubborn refusal to bend to the town's gossip. He'd buried his first wife, Mary, 5 years prior, and the loneliness had carved deep lines into his heart. When he saw Clara step through the barn doors, her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet resolve, something stirred in him, a recognition of courage he hadn't expected. The townsfolk parted, their murmurs trailing her like a shadow. Amos stepped forward, offering his hand. Clara's lips curved into a shy smile as she took it, her palm warm against his calloused fingers. The preacher, a wiry man with a skeptical brow, began the ceremony, but the crowd's snickers drowned out his words. Clara didn't notice. Her gaze was fixed on Amos, reading his lips as he repeated his vows. The ceremony was brief, but the reception that followed, meant to be a community celebration, was anything but welcoming. Tables groaned under platters of cornbread and smoked brisket, but the air was thick with condescension. A woman named Beatrice, whose husband owned the general store, leaned toward her friend and said, "She'll be useless out here. Can't even hear a storm coming." Clara, seated beside Amos, caught the woman's smirk from the corner of her eye. She'd learned long ago to read faces, to sense cruelty in a glance. Her heart sank, but she kept her hands folded, her expression serene. Amos, though, noticed her stiffening posture. He squeezed her hand under the table, his thumb brushing her knuckles. A silent promise she felt more than heard. As the evening wore on, the townsfolk's mockery grew careless, fueled by whiskey and boredom. A young man, emboldened by the crowd, stood and raised his glass. "To Amos's new bride," he slurred, "who'll probably scare the cattle mute." Laughter erupted, harsh and unrelenting. Clara's cheeks flushed, but she kept her eyes on her plate, tracing the edge with her finger. Amos's jaw tightened, his chair scraping as he stood. The barn fell silent, every eye on him. His voice, low and steady, carried a weight that stilled the room. "You laugh at her," he said, "but Clara's better than all of you." The words hung heavy like a storm cloud ready to break. "She's got more heart than this whole town combined. You mock what you don't understand, but I'll tell you this. She's stronger than any of you'll ever be." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but Amos wasn't done. He turned to Clara, his eyes softening. "She came here alone, to a place that don't know her, to build a life with a man she's only known through letters. That takes guts, more than any of you have shown, sitting here judging her." Clara watched his lips, piecing together his words, her chest tightening with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. But the moment was shattered by a piercing scream from outside the barn. "Fire!" someone shouted. The crowd surged toward the doors, chaos erupting as smoke billowed from the direction of the stables. Clara didn't hear the screams, but she saw the panic. Faces contorted, bodies rushing past. She stood, her eyes darting to the orange glow flickering beyond the barn. The stables where Amos's horses were kept were ablaze. Without hesitation, she ran toward the danger, her dress catching on brambles as she moved. Amos shouted after her, but she didn't see his lips. She was already gone, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain. The townsfolk froze, too stunned or scared to act, but Clara plunged into the smoke. She'd spent her childhood on a farm, tending animals, learning their ways through touch and sight. She didn't need to hear their fear to feel it. Inside the stable, the heat was suffocating, flames licking the wooden beams. Clara's eyes stung as she moved swiftly, unlatching stalls. The horses, wild with terror, reared and stamped, but she approached them calmly, her hands steady as she guided them out. One by one, she led them to safety, her dress singed, her face smudged with soot. The last horse, a young mare, was trapped behind a fallen beam. Clara dropped to her knees, heaving at the wood with all her strength. Her hands bled, splinters digging into her skin, but she didn't stop. Amos reached her just as the beam gave way, helping her pull the mare free. Together they stumbled into the cool night air, the horse trembling but alive. The townsfolk stood in stunned silence, their earlier laughter replaced by shame. Beatrice, tears in her eyes, stepped forward, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, Clara, we were wrong. Others nodded, their faces flushed with guilt. Clara, catching her breath, didn't need to hear their apologies to understand. She saw it in their eyes, the shift from judgment to awe. Amos wrapped his arm around her, his voice thick with pride as he whispered, "You're a wonder, Clara." She read his lips and smiled, her heart full despite the ache in her hands. In the days that followed, the town's attitude changed. Clara, once a stranger, became a quiet hero. Women who'd mocked her now sought her out, bringing pies and asking for gardening tips. Men tipped their hats, their respect earned by her courage. Clara and Amos worked side by side, building a life rooted in mutual trust. She taught him to see the world through her eyes, through gestures, through touch, through the unspoken language of kindness. The ranch flourished not just with cattle and crops, but with something deeper, a love that spoke louder than words. Years later, when Clara and Amos sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the plains gold, she traced the scars on her hands from that night. They were a reminder, not of pain, but of the moment she showed a town what strength truly meant. The townsfolk never forgot, and neither did she. In a world that often laughed at differences, Clara's heart had proven louder than their voices, a testament to the power of compassion to transform even the hardest hearts. And as the stars emerged, Clara knew she'd found her place, not just on the ranch, but in a community that finally saw her for who she was, better than they'd ever dared to believe.